So that means after 100 years, lime actually starts to get young, right? And when you compare to concrete, if you make a house with concrete and you don't plaster it with those plastic paints, what happens is that, because the chemical property of that material is that it'll wear off, right? So the house we live in actually has an age of like 70 years max, right? When you start living in the biohomes we are developing, those houses will last like thousands of years, right? Because it starts to get young, like, because by principle of carbonation it wants to become stone again. So literally a house over the years becomes like stone. 100 साल के बाद चूना जवान होता है.
Someone who is a billionaire and someone who is below poverty line is exposed to the same kind of toxic exposure.
Until you identify a problem, there is no way of coming up with a solution.
It actually has a negative 2 carbon footprint.
You're sitting at home doing nothing else, you're sitting shopping online, calling for stuff that you probably will use once in a couple of years.
Each of us needs to like just be a little bit more curious, I guess, to like understand where does the product that you purchased actually come from.
This is colonization of ideas, right? That kacha versus a pakka makan concept.
The only way good stuff becomes cheaper is when things are done at scale.
One of the biggest problems in the world is consumerism. The world does not have like good materials to begin with, right? To design a better future, right? So we've solved that problem through Reformary, right? And what's more important, it's like the materials need to be healthy materials, right? So unfortunately, like last 100 200 years, we have had a human first approach to problem solving, right? And when you start thinking from a perspective of health, it's also like human health first. What is convenient for a human, right? And I think like a paradigm shift in I think like has to be like, it should be a planet first approach. Like, planet's health should be the priority, and automatically it feels. So I think, to give you a context of the problem, I think this is how we look at the solution, because we do believe like a bigger issue in the world is toxicity, right? So how toxins are getting ingested into our water systems, how toxins are getting into our soil, how they are entering our atmosphere. Like these are the larger problems. Like I think like what's causing climate change are these toxins, right? In a nutshell, right? And hence we
Yeah, like I think, disease doesn't discriminate. And I think that's why we tend to have a slightly more optimistic approach, right? Because someone who is a billionaire and someone who is below poverty line is exposed to the same kind of toxic exposure. And today there's studies that show that, a study in fact conducted in New York City showed that like a fetus was actually exposed to over 270 toxic chemicals. So if fetal health, if we were to focus on just that, you've already kind of created, just like we've created a world together where you've not even given that fetus a fair chance to come into like a world, right? Like, and then forget about like once that infant is born and then grows up, and over time, like how just pollution, whether it's indoor pollution or outdoor pollution, is going to continue affecting them. I think it's really important to kind of look from that perspective. And the reason why we say disease doesn't discriminate is, at the end of the day, like we're building these massive, like sort of hospitals and research centers, on preventative care, or even to kind of understand these diseases, but if we know that these diseases can be prevented by just improving the kind of materials or like
objects we expose ourselves to.
I think the fashion industry is the most I guess like they've been at the forefront of talking about slow fashion, because it is something that people kind of like are able to like understand better, right? Because it's something that you put on your body. There's so many different kinds of like, conversations around fast fashion and slow fashion, but we don't tend to do that in other industries, especially in the construction and building space.
Today, you're sitting at home doing nothing else. You're sitting shopping online,
Yeah.
calling for stuff that you probably will use once in a couple of years.
Yeah.
I think I had a relative or something who was like, "Oh yeah, I bought a bunch of stuff online, but in order to make sure that I use that stuff sustainably, I was like, I'm not gonna hang this up until I take out one thing and give it away, and that's when I replace it with something I've just ordered."
I'm going to open the war of comment zone, okay?
Yeah.
And I'm going to give completely opposite opinion to all of you.
Okay.
Okay, cool. So consumerism is very important because the lower half of the food chain, the poor people, get access to good stuff once the good stuff becomes cheaper.
Which is where fast fashion comes into play.
The only way good stuff becomes cheaper is when things are done at scale. So let's talk about construction. So when we're talking about construction, high pollution construction, consuming resources that may not be the healthiest for the planet, allows for poorer nations such as India, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, name the nation, to have roads, to have buildings. Yes, it brings in pollution. But now you have to do the cost benefit analysis. Would I rather my country pops out of poverty, has infrastructure, and gets to live a better life versus the world? Or would I rather save the environment? And in the short run, it is almost always that I need to build an infrastructure in order for them to be concerned about the greater problems, right?
The moment you have these needs met,
Yeah.
it is only then you're like, okay, now let me start thinking, what can I do to make the environment better around? If I'm only not living in, what do I say, basic comfort, as we're talking about fair wages and all this is essentially to meet these demands. That each person should have roti, kapda, makan, internet.
I want to add on the fashion front also.
Yeah.
When I talk about Calvin Klein or Gucci or Armani or all of these things, a lot of manufacturing happens in Panipat, which is the city I'm from. And same factories will manufacture Kirkland, which is a Costco brand, and there will be a price gap. So it is not just quality, it is perception. Okay. I, despite how much money I have, would go for the Kirkland brand t-shirt. Because why not? It's the same thing I know personally. Right? Now, whether I get to change my t-shirt more often, whether I get to consume more t-shirts, on the other side is that poor people are getting to have very nice t-shirts. Right? How do we balance this problem? And it cannot just be education, because educating the top 1% is cool, but top 1% consumption, even if high, is not as high as the bottom 9.
Of course. So I think that's why when we talk about education, right, like unfortunately the terminology that is used, right, currently, can it be translated into multi-regional languages, right? So like on one hand, we're talking about a quality t-shirt, but what if that quality t-shirt is also leaking microplastics? It's made out of nylon, right? Like it's also the kind of materials or like the kind of yarn that has been used.
Are there alternatives that have the same price to output ratio?
So I think, when we talk, like this is such a interesting like topic for me, because I think the moment you put a brand name onto something, right, that's actually what you're buying in. The quality you associate with brand. But why can not your local tailor also make you something that is beautiful? You're buying that fabric. So it really does come down to like, how do you kind of take ownership in your life?
Is it the consumer's responsibility or the company's responsibility?
I think decolonization is a very important word here, and I think like that pretty much like answers a lot of your uh, the problems you're talking about. So the Indian culture, right? Like when slowly and steadily like the colonizers started coming, starting with trade, right? But when it came to the crux of the matter, where the degree of their propaganda like started to take shape, right? Like we can look at the example of the Tamils, right? Like what they did to the Tamils, right? Like they broke all they cut the thumbs of all the artisans who used to make loom, they created systems within India, right? Like to make sure that like most of the farmers are growing like cotton, right? Like so that like the and like, in the Western world where the industrial revolution was happening, like they could create a supply chain of growing cotton in India and like exporting it and manufacturing like fabric there, and that fabric getting circulated all over the world, right? And what we lost as a culture, right? We like for example hemp fabrics or something, right? That was the lost, you know. There's so many different kinds of like handloom techniques, like talk about silk. There's so many ingenious ways, like of how uh, our people, the Indian people, were making textile, right? And it all changed forever, right? So what we need to focus on is that, yeah, on one side you're talking about economies of scale, array this is cheaper, this is not, right? But what we need to we could continue with this madness, like which I think it's sheer madness. What you mentioned, like economic strata, like and like you buying a T-shirt versus like a other guy buying a T-shirt. I don't think like the people of the villages are really like motivated to buy like Zara T-shirts. All they really need is like they need a yarn, and they don't even have access to these brands like the fast fashion brands, right? So most of the research for Parsons, for example, is in New York, right? And they're studying the underprivileged housing societies of uh, like New York, for example. That's where like the most toxic materials were used, right? Because these are government-based housing, right?
Cheapest material.
The
The
cheapest.
poorest get the worst,
So
right?
what's
But
actually
in
sad?
India,
Yeah.
it's actually very different. Most of the working class, you could call it the India 2, India 2, 3, India 3, they live in healthier homes than the ones we live in.
What do you mean by that?
Like that marketing of that. So this is colonization of ideas, right? That kacha versus a pakka makan concept, right? Like everyone comes here, they see that, oh, like ideal home is the one which is made with concrete, right? That is the pakka makan, right? And they go back to their villages learning, hoping that like we are actually inspiring them. When they look at our infrastructure and our housing, they go back and they're actually breaking their better, healthier homes and creating these concrete structures, right? You look at Himachal, right? You look at like how quickly like the ecosystem is changing. Like the traditional wooden homes, like the traditional mud homes, Adobe homes, they're all going out, which have survived for like thousands of years,
But
right?
I think this is not just an India problem. Like I was just in Bali, and my friend and I ended up booking um, like a place to stay, like post our course, and we thought we were going to one village, but we booked the wrong like place, right? But so thanks to that, we ended up discovering a completely new area in Bali, and I would say 70% of that village is still like like they've been able to like maintain their old traditional sort of like community based homes, but in the main area, like the main road areas, right, like they've actually actively started now building with concrete and completely gone away from what was traditional and native to them. And I think that that's a similar issue that we are seeing in India, where like the preservation of these techniques and traditions, right?
When you start a product, right, it starts from like point A, right, and it serves its life, right, its first life, like any material. It could be your clothing, it could be your house, it could be anything you consume, right? Once its first life is over, right, what happens to that product, right, and where it ends up, right, and what it does to our ecosystem, that whole circle needs to be like replanned and redesigned, right? So unfortunately, like all the topics we'll end up talking about might feel that they're like just ideological ideas, but at the end of the day, let's talk about concrete, right? A very very important product, right? Like for like the infrastructure we are building, right? But let's look at any home, like this house, right? Like this house itself will serve its life at one point of time, At one point of time, you or your parents will decide that we'll break this, right? And we'll probably construct a better and a nicer place, right? Right. So when you break this house, right, like all this like malwa, all the things, will end up going into a landfill, right? Now, when they land in a landfill, if we don't process this waste, which because this house has served, right? Like we'll go to the land, nothing can grow on that land, right? Like that land becomes unfertile forever, right? You cannot do anything, right? For you, your purpose is solved, right? Like you had the money, right? You broke it and you constructed a new house, right? So that's where, like the materials we are developing, for example, like we are making alternate construction materials, right? Where which actually serve a whole life, and we are 100% inspired by, like, Vedic architectural techniques. Our study has been that, like, we as a world, like, because our perspective, man, like we live what, 100 years, like 80 years, 90 years, but like the invention of like modern concrete, the invention of all these substances is very young, right? What we need to start looking at is that what did our ancestors do, right? How were we living like 1,000 years, 1500 years before, right? And those might be the right answers, right? When it comes to food, we're going back to organic farming, right? Like we understand the need. Like in a similar way, we are heading towards a generation, we are starting to wear natural and breathable fabrics, right? Like because you feel better also. The third transition will be like we need to, and which we primarily focus on is like healthier and sustainable homes, right? Who serve the purpose, but once their purpose is done, right, that material itself doesn't like harm or affect the environment.
Today, these things are great if you have the luxury. Today, someone sitting in a village who wants to build a concrete home. Why do they want to build a concrete home? If my village floods, my house won't float away. It will still stay standing. Today, if I have a mud house and something happens, it's very easy for my house to collapse.
That
We
is
are actually
kind of,
projecting our thinking onto them, because
yeah.
you or a lot of people, we don't come with actual, those houses have survived earthquakes, right? Like multiple earthquakes, they have survived like multiple flooding, and they've still survived. They just that they did, like we didn't acknowledge them, and slowly like we feel that these like modern building materials are like so much better, and we are actually when people come to the cities, they get inspired by like our style of architecture and living, right? They go back believing that this is better, but in no way, like, it is. So
Yeah, like, and I think to add to that, like, we forget that how much aspiration actually fuels all of this, right? And that's kind of really like where we like to draw inspiration from every person who's involved in our team. Like recently, our carpenter bhaiya, like he was looking at how a 3D printer works, like 3D printing homes work. And he's like, oh, aapko pata hai, hamare village mein, we used to actually come together and the entire village would get together and build their neighbor's home. And it was built in the exact style that a 3D printed home is built today.
like,
So
in
when
a
you kind of take ancient technology, ancient sort of like traditions and practices, and let's find a way to bring technology to it in order to combat all the things that you guys were talking about, right? And everyone will question that, which is that how do you kind of reduce like the cost? Because yes, like for us as well, we're not trying to build premium products, like, because then we've defeated ourselves, right, in this journey. The idea is to be able to come up with materials that is accessible to everybody. If our labor bhaiya is
100%.
being exposed to multiple chemicals and I get to like live in this beautiful fancy house, maybe I'm more conscious, right? But it wouldn't sit well with me knowing that he's gone back with a respiratory disease, or he's exposing his own family with the number of chemicals he's interacting with on a day-to-day basis, right? So here, this is where the topic of, is it the producer's fault, his problem, or as a homeowner, do I sit there saying, you know what, I will not work with a contractor that will not look into the safety of their workers, right? That's where I get to have a say. And this is where I think for us, the term, I mean, maybe the term conscious consumerism is greenwashing in its own self, right? But we don't know a better term right now. And it's important to have the kind of dialogues like we are having, but it's also important to take these dialogues back to our team. So for us, I mean, the idea of like a podcast that is then, let's say, translated into all sorts of languages that I've spoken in this country, so that today, if I was to now take this episode back to our karigars, there's someone who speaks Hindi and Bengali, there's someone who speaks, Kashmiri and Tamil. Like, how will they understand these concepts? And it's about allowing storytelling to kind of come back and be the forefront of this.
Absolutely.
When we talk about unlearning, how did we learn back in the day? Your Nukkar Natak, right? Like your puppet shows. That's how you actually were able to like reach a much larger audience. It's not about talking in the kind of jargon or using big fancy words. I think that's the kind of unlearning, unconditioning that all of us need to do, I mean, I myself, I'm embarrassed to admit this, for me, like going to America was just this big ass dream, and I've never been prouder to come back now, because I'm like, I can't believe I had to go to another country to learn about just incredible stuff that is in our own country, but I've just been conditioned to believe it's not cool.
What is the material you've created? How do you get it out there? And how do you get it out there so that enough people can use it in a way that actually affects? We say boon boon se sagar banta hai, but at the same time, I don't think we're at a point where we can take that time.
Yeah.
We have to now be pouring in the bucket loads.
We primarily have about 6 to 7 products. So one of our primary product is a product we are calling it Agricrete, right? Agricrete, the components of Agricrete is like agricultural waste, and India has a lot of like agricultural waste, and we know the problems of burning agricultural waste, which causes a lot of pollution. So one of the components, one of the ingredients rather in our material is agricultural waste. We mix it with cow dung, we mix it with fuller's earth, and we add lime, which is slaked lime is what we use, which kind of like a mixture and a combination of the right ratios of the formula creates Agricrete, right? So Agricrete like is solving a lot of problems, right? Firstly, like we are reclaiming waste, and as I said that we are generating so much waste, and we figured out ways. With this material, we figured out a way how to use all that and create like a alternate construction material, which could be even better than traditional concrete in the years to come. We are not claiming that it is an actual alternate to concrete in today, but as we continue to work, this could be a game changer.
What is Fuller's Earth?
Fuller's Earth is Multani Mitti, right? And man, like these recipes are actually ancient recipes, right? Like so, the combination of like cow dung and Fuller's Earth is a traditional like Ladakhi and Kashmiri plaster, right? And these products have like amazing physical and chemical properties.
Can you use cow dung that comes out as output from a biogas plant?
We could, but potentially like see like there are two kinds of dungs also. Like one is that most of the gaushalas and the cow shelters, right, like they are feeding the cows grains, right? And when so that kind of cow dung is not ideal for us because it has a lot of like mucky smell.
And that's also like a lot of Jersey cows, right? So
And
like
a lot
the
of
kind
Jersey
of
cows,
cow dung that we use is from the desi cow, because the desi cow has like a particular kind of enzyme naturally, like that breaks down whatever fodder that they eat in a particular way. So it has to be a particular kind of desi cow's dung that you use.
And
You can't just go out
they
and use
should
any
be
kind of
they
dung also.
and of course like the pasture, like they are eating like the pastures, the grass, they're not getting fed with these grains. And also like it goes through a process of like uh, going antibacterial, because we can't have like active bacterias and things which could cause fungal growth. So man, like again, the inspiration is ancient materials. Like why our formulation became proprietary is that we started looking at like so chemically, like the process of it's a process called carbonation, right? Like so lime is a magical material. Like it's like I personally feel that it is one of the main ingredients in concrete also. right? Like, so it's not us reinventing the wheel, but that's the ancient material, right? So to give you like the traditional mortars of, let's say, Jammu, like a use of lime and jaggery and like chana dal was something like they would explore.
What was this used for?
These are the mortars, like,
Okay,
the
yeah.
mortars of the traditional architecture,
Yeah.
right? And these buildings have survived through time. We talk about the Taj Mahal. The Persians got a formulation of egg white and lime together. So the foundations of Taj Mahal and all these like amazing architectural the Persians have built, is based on this formula. So where every part of India, right, have had different recipes and different formulations. So coming to the Agricrete, right, and the carbonation. So basically, lime, when it's slaked, right, it when you add water, it produces a lot of heat. It bubbles, right, and produces carbon dioxide at that stage. And once we cure it, like, and you apply it as a plaster or in our Agricrete and various uses, right? What chemically it's trying to do is that it's taking carbon from the air, right, and trying to become limestone again, because the source is limestone, which we make quick lime from, and then slake lime, and right, and it's the natural process of lime, and the tendency of lime is to become stone again. So to be honest, like in this room, most likely you guys have like a plastics distemper, right, which you have painted. So you change this paint because one of our products is like, we have a cow dung plaster, which is one product, and the other product is a lime plaster. You replace that, your house itself becomes, the walls become breathable. They're actually taking, so rather than putting snake plants in your room and indoor, right, you should just like switch to like a healthier and a better plate which we are developing, right? And it solves a major problem, right? And we feel that, like, that's where like the whole circular economic principles. Now we were talking earlier about the life cycle of the product, right? So let's say like we build a house, right, and we are in fact like building a few homes now. We're calling them bio homes, right? We're doing projects in Maharashtra. We might be doing projects in UP. We've already built one of our first prefabs in Jammu, right? Like this is years back, right? Uh, so what happens to that house, like, once it's served its purpose, right? So this aggregate material, once it's taken, right, it can so lime has a natural tendency of like balancing the pH level. So if the soil for farmers, like if the soil has a really high pH, right, so lime and our material can be used into landfills to balance the pH level of the soil for making it uh, more efficient for farming. And the second use case which we work around is that lime has like natural tendencies of like being antifungal, antibacterial. Because when we are creating like the future biomaterials of the world, we are like uh, taking inspiration from like the Vedic school of thought, right, of architecture, uh, looking into building materials which were like used 50, 60 years prior to today's time. And a lot of great solutions come out. And two things, I'll say before we conclude this. Kahavat hai, like, especially in Marwadi, like, there are two three kahavats, right? One is that 100 saal ke baad chuna jawan hota hai. So that means after 100 years, lime actually starts to get young, right? And when you compare to concrete, if you make a house with concrete and you don't plaster it with those plastic paints, what happens is that, because the chemical property of that material is that it'll wear off, right? So the house we live in actually has an age of like 70 years max, right? When you start living in the biohomes we are developing, those houses will last like thousands of years, right? Because it starts to get young, like, because by principle of carbonation it wants to become stone again. So literally a house over the years becomes like stone.
You say all these materials, all of these practices, they're coming down from, as you said, Vedic things and things that were used in earlier civilizations. Where was like this knowledge is inherent to our country? You're saying it's tradition that things were done in a certain way. Why has it taken so long? What is the reason? Where was this?
So this is
Again,
so
so
this
as
is
to say-
also where we talk a lot about decolonization, because I think a lot of these resources either have been lost in time, or um, the, the 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 loss of language as well. Translation from one language to the other has also, you sometimes like lose the the essence of what is trying to be communicated as well, right? And um, what also ends up happening is that, like, let's say, like when we talk about like handicrafts and that kind of like art, like those kind of artisans, the future generations are not wanting to learn what is passed down in their sort of like their transfer of knowledge generationally, because they know that they're not enough like opportunities available, so like someone who may be like a fifth generation carpenter today sees more merit in learning software engineering and getting a job there. So it is a huge issue that we tend to like sort of face, because when we talk about cost, a lot of times the kind of products that we're developing also tend to be labor intensive. Now, is that labor skilled to know how to build an Adobe home? A huge opportunity that we've kind of been able to like tap into now is understanding how we can start training women, because now how you gundo atta, right, is a similar way that you can gundo one of our materials,
Biomaterials,
right?
right?
So like, can we then open up this conversation and dialogue about having a skilled and a more equal workforce, but also now training women, and not having them just be like the brick lifters and like the bricklayers, but also becoming part of our like formulations team, our research team, our development team, because this is something that they're used to. Like, it's just natural to them to like use their hands.
And to be honest, like most of the ancient building materials actually come from the kitchen. Like it's like literally like biomaterials
Yeah.
is like how you bake a cake. It's like that formulations. It's a spectrum. So it's like very a lot of like bioplastics are getting developed in the world. They all literally you can make bioplastics in your home.
What is an Adobe home?
Adobe, so these are like mud homes.
The mud homes,
Yeah.
like the traditional mud homes you see in Himachal, and like,
So you can't use any kind of mud. You of course
it has
need
to have a decent clay content. So you'll see you can't build mud homes in let's say the northeast of India, right? Also like southern India, like not a lot of like tropical lands have that, but the Ladakh, the Himalayan mountain range, you could like definitely build. Even where we are, Delhi, like this whole belt has very good like clay content. UP has like very high clay content.
As there's this concept of demand supply. Simple as the more the demand, the more supply I need. Am I compressed on my supply? If I am, then the price rises. When you talk about sustainable materials such as lime or Multani Mitti, is there enough? Is there enough of it available to serve a population of 140, 150 crore people, which is increasing at all times?
Yeah,
And-
forget 140, 150 or 800 crore people in the world.
No, let's talk about India, right? So is there enough of it that we can sustainably, in terms of money, do it at scale? And also, money is a very important point of discussion, because you talk about electrical vehicles. Only when they have become cheaper have people been able to buy them. They have only become cheaper because more of them can be produced. And more of them can be produced because we can get more batteries out. But batteries are now the bottleneck. Eventually, we'll have to recycle the batteries and we'll be stuck. Right? So, the same cycle applies to what you guys are doing. So, what is the demand supply like?
Let's take the example of Agricrete. Like 60% of the formula is agricultural waste. So it's, I think, like the point which we are taking home here is like reducing the use of these natural uh, limited materials. We totally agree. Like Fuller's Earth, Multani Mitti, lime, they're all very limited resources, right? Like, but when you look at the formulation of cement, it also uses lime, like, because lime is that ingredient. So if you buy like cement, it's not that it's solving that problem. We actually have solved a huge problem, because 60% of our alternate material, biomaterial, is actually agricultural waste. So that's the solver. I think reducing the use is key. now when it comes to supply chains, right, like, and I think it's a solid question which we are figuring out. India is a great story, man. Like Amul is the biggest story in the world, how a group, how you developing a cluster can actually solve like a major problem, right? We actually, like, Amul as a company was probably the most pivotal in our independence movement. They were the dark horses. No one talks about Amul, but like the farmers and the cow bearers, like, coming together and building Amul was a big punch to the Britishers, right? In a similar way, like now what we in our board meetings we have finalized, right? Like, because we are now amping into manufacturing. We plan to create clusters of like agricultural waste generators, right? And our factories are not going to be like one mega factory in like some part of India, right, where all the agricultural waste, that completely defeats the purpose. For us, like, one of the beautiful things about Agricrete is that if we are working in, let's say, Delhi, we work with wheat husk. When we are doing projects in Maharashtra, like, we are working with rice husk. When we're doing projects in Rajasthan, right, we've developed material like a formulation using millet husk, bajra husk. So the agricultural waste has to be native to the land. So all these waste generators, these bulk waste generators, like, bring their product into a central unit where the final formulations will get built. And we feel that for something which is actually a problem and the farmers end up burning the crop, it actually gives them like so much economic growth. And once we start working on the cluster level, the product will come into the supply chain in a big way, right? Because we feel that that's the model we want to build. First step was invention. Second step, what we are working today on, right, like, and we have built a experience center with a very dear friend of ours, Anurag. Like, he runs a studio called Seven Sense, right? And Seven Sense and us are combining forces, right, to figure out ways that how the application of these building materials comes into the picture. So I guess, like, with innovative technological use of application in real world construction and working on a core level with the farmer community and building these clusters is gonna eventually, I think, like 3 to 4 years, we could solve a major problem.
One problem that if you solve today will take Reformary one step forward or 10 steps forward, or how many? What is your biggest problem today?
So it is streamlining these supply chains for certain materials that we require for our formulations. And the second, so it would be like, let's say, working with smaller vendors, right? So like, let's say we talk about cow dung, right? For us, that quality testing each time to make sure that if we're making, like, let's say 100 bricks, and then when we have to make 1,000 bricks and then 10,000 bricks, right? That quality control on each step for each batch that you're creating, right? That's where at this current phase we've been facing like some issues, right, where it you don't get that consistency right away, and that's also like a problem that we've kind of identified, that when you're thinking on a macro level, these are things that you're going to actually face if you're not solving them on the micro level to begin with, right? So like, if we're working with 3 vendors, can we like increase that pool to 6 vendors? Can we increase it to 10 vendors, right, within a certain like like a radius, then it's like the setting of those materials, right? We work with basically like all our bricks are cured using like natural like processes, right? So we're
We
dependent
don't
on
use
the
any
sun.
furnaces,
So we
so
don't, yeah.
it actually has a -2 carbon footprint. So by using our material, you're actually quenching like carbon out inside
Yeah.
the material rather than. So the overall process has
Yeah.
a -2 carbon footprint,
Yeah,
right? Which is a winner in
Yeah.
all degrees.
Yeah, and I think to answer your question,
But a very good point,
Yeah.
actually. So supply chain.
Yeah.
But I feel, and that's been our challenge.
Yeah.
Like, I think, and you would agree with it.
Yeah.
I think education, right?
Yeah.
So man, like, coming here, like, even with you guys, right? I don't think like we sometimes like can't put up point across. But I'll give you an example. Let's talk about life expectancies of karigars, like, craftsmen, like life expectancy. A general painter in India, right? Like, who works with like toxic, like, we have figured out, like, because we have developed paints and plasters also, which are our product line, right? So right now in the supply chain, not naming any brands or anything, right? Their products are toxic. They have heavy metals in them, right? They produce like a lot of like VOCs, right, which are like they're volatile organic compounds, right, which and that's what you when you go to a when you go into that fresh paint smell, right, like you actually get high out of it. It's full of like toxins, right?
Yeah.
And man, like the life expectancy of these carriers is like the age of 47, right? What happens is they work in the big cities, they're working with these toxic materials, they're putting their hands, they don't use safety gears, they're not using any mask.
Yeah.
The bichare, these guys go to their villages, kidney failures, right? They die, no one cares because there's so many, right? So now with our materials, man, like our carriers, you can put our materials on your face, man, right? There's nothing in it. It's something like it could be a face mask if you want it to be.
Multani Mitti is one of the most common ingredients in face masks, isn't it?
Right, and I think that educating people, see today in this podcast, if I say that we paint your room with a lime plaster, right, or when you build your next home, let it be a bio home made by Reformary, right, like will you give us that chance is something like I think is a bigger challenge, right, like cause we can figure out everything, but it's people, like cause if you are okay, like living in a toxic home, cause see humans, there's a whole world which is a microscopic world which we all can't see, right? But this glass here, right, your paint is deteriorating every second, right? Like there is dust particles which we can't see with our naked eye. That's where like microplastics come into the picture, right? Like we are getting born with microplastics in our body. All that things, if we don't start, like I don't know how, I think our challenge, and that's where Reformary, the name, comes with two words: reformation and elementary. So the material science aspect, the research and development side, is the reformation, right? The elementary, which is the educational part, is something we feel like, and this is a way for us to, this is elementary, like hopefully millions of people see this, right, and maybe like they start supporting our businesses.
Inshallah, we haven't started with the problem, but I think we're coming to a close with the
We're going
problem.
to start the podcast here. So, guys, we have a tradition on the podcast. The last founder has left you a question, and we would love for you to leave a question for the next founder. The question we have for you, and we would love an answer from both of you: where do you see your company in the next 5 years?
What definitely we hope to achieve in the next 5 years is, of course, some of our like our main bread and butter is, of course, creating these IPs, but I think 5 years from now we hope to also have a side of our company which is also open source, so that there can be like multiple companies that are inspired by us that can mushroom and help us actually solve the supply chain issue. So for us, there's not really a figure that we're looking at, but yes, it is about being able to use our experience and have half proprietary, half open source, and then just see where this takes us, and
Yeah.
hopefully 5 years from now we will be talking to some founders who were inspired by our journey. So that's really where we hope to see us.
Guys, if you feel you can help them with their supply chain problems, please reach out. Reach out to us. We'll connect you to them, and let's do some business together.
And we are going to have them back for part 2 very soon, where you will learn a lot more about manufacturing these materials.